Okay, so we're going to continue in this tshuva. Rav Gestetner, in his Shilas Tshuvas Lahoros Nasan, this tshuva is written in the 80s, and the question that was asked of him, just to review, was that an established yeshiva hired a Rosh Yeshiva, and this Rosh Yeshiva had a falling out with the administration, and he decided to open up his own competing yeshiva, and most of the students went with the Rosh Yeshiva. This left the administration of the first yeshiva holding the bag. They had many debts and so forth, and they came to Rav Gestetner to find out what the proper halachic position of this was. And in the course of this discussion, Rav Gestetner ended up quoting two apparently sort of competing sentiments, that on the one hand, it is permitted, when it comes to Torah study, there is an unlimited amount of free enterprise. We don't limit Torah study in any way, and even if one yeshiva or kollel or beis medrash wants to open down the road from the other, it's totally okay. But on the other hand, we looked at our halacha that we're studying now in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, which is that you cannot try and poach the customer of one malamed, of one tutor, and try to make yourself the new tutor for that private individual, if it's going to cause financial loss for the first guy. So Rav Gestetner had pointed out that one of the difficulties, or sort of one of the ways to sort of resolve that seeming contradiction, is that we had said there are a couple of differences. One difference is that when you put up a shingle to advertise to the public, you're not in particular trying to take away a specific customer from one person. And the way that Rav Gestetner also had phrased it was that you're also not exploiting and capitalizing on the efforts of that other person, of your competitor. It's always okay to compete with the public, to compete for public patronage of your product or of your services. But if the first guy that had come along had invested a huge amount to generate a market to begin with, and then the copycat comes along after he's put in all of this effort to generate all of that, all of the marketing and all of the effort to put that business into motion, and then the copycat comes along, then if you're capitalizing off of your competitor's efforts, so then that's like the guy who sets up his fishing nets upstream, where the other guy has already set up his nets and put out his bait, and so forth. Or taking the olives that fall to the ground from the guy who climbed up the tree and had shaken the tree to get the olives off. Okay? So that's where we're up to. All right? So so let us continue in the practical. Now Rav Gestetner goes really into the practical issue of this particular yeshiva. Okay? Now, someone was asking me yesterday, or I think it was Ron, who was talking about competing shuls, right? And so, I was thinking about it. The history of Thornhill is, there were exclusively two entities that started Thornhill religiously. Was Chabad and was Joe Tannenbaum and the Bayit. So before those two entities came along, there was nothing. This was farmland. It wasn't properly cultivated. There was no religious community here, and the Orthodox Jews came flocking to Thornhill primarily because of the Bayit. And now, thank God, Thornhill is a different animal. It's a different creature. It's a different kind of neighborhood where you have Shtibelach opening up. But would you be able to make that argument that all of the little shuls that are cropping up are capitalizing on the hard efforts of the Bayit? No, I mean, you could make that argument, but at the same time, for how long can you make that argument? I mean, the Bayit opened up a generation ago, or over a generation ago, so in which case, perhaps the argument that you're capitalizing or exploiting the efforts of the first guy who came here cannot be made anymore, because these shuls are primarily establishing the children or the children's friends or peers of the people who came to the bayit in the first place. So I want you to consider that, that argument that you're not allowed to capitalize off of the efforts of the first guy who was here does have limits as well. There should be perhaps a statute of limitations, or how direct or indirect is the benefit that you're getting off of the efforts of the first person. Okay, so let's now take a look. V'hinei b'nidon didan. So in our scenario of this yeshiva, where the Rosh Yeshiva left and took all of the students, or most of the students, sheminahalei umiyasadei hayeshiva amlu lahakim es hayeshiva. He says the administrators worked really hard to set up this first yeshiva. V'yadua shahakomat yeshiva krucha b'yigia rabbah uvahashkaot uvahotzaot merubot. And we know that setting up a yeshiva involves a tremendous amount of work, a tremendous amount of investment and expenditure. Vadai shemi shegorem lahavkia midei hamiyasdim et hatalmidim ad shehayeshiva niskira v'yigiu lidei hezek. So certainly, if a person causes the administration to lose all of its students and to be forced to close the yeshiva, and thereby come to tremendous financial loss, so this is no different from the famous Ani Hamahapech Becharara, the poor man who's prospecting a heap of garbage. No one else is allowed to come by and try to take it away from him. This guy set up shop, or these administrators set up shop, and all of a sudden, this Rosh Yeshiva, this very charismatic guy, comes along, infiltrates into the organization, and then has a falling out and ends up taking everyone with him. That's the way it's being portrayed over here. And it's not fair. It's not fair to the original administration. The Afal Gav de Ein Safek, Shagam Rosh HaYeshiva, Sheniskabel Al Yidei HaMenalim Hishkia Kocho B'Talmidim. Now, to be fair to the Rosh Hashiva, there's no question that when he was hired, he also put in a lot of effort and worked very hard to attract the students. And there's no question that he was able to increase the numbers of the student body. Uviglal shmo hatov nitrabu tormim v'nadvanim lahachzakat hayeshiva. And unquestionably, because of the Rosh Hashiva's good name, he was able to attract more donors and more people to support the yeshiva. Mikol makom harei barur ki ikar kiyum hayeshiva hu mikolcham shel hamenahalim. But let's be honest. How did the yeshiva get started, and how did it get off the ground? That was because of the administrators. Shehem kiblu al atzmam achrayut lesapek et tzorchei talmidim v'hamalamdim midei chodesh. They're the ones who accepted upon themselves to shoulder the burden of meeting the monthly paychecks, of having to pay everyone and having to cover all of the expenses. The Rosh Yeshiva never had to do any of that. V'doagu leparnasatam, and they worried about making sure that everyone would get paid and would make a salary. V'nichnasu ba'ol chovot liknot binyan avor talmidim, and they entered into debt to make sure that they could purchase a building for the students. Ve'ein safek ki al yedei amalam na'asu talmidim kachativa echat, and unquestionably because of their efforts, the student body became unified. V'ilav amalam shel hamenahalim vaday shelo haya biyad rosh hayeshiva lesov et kol hatalmidim ha'elu lavim liyeshiva shelo. And like in any partnership, you can't do it yourself. And had it not been for these administrators, the Rosh Yeshiva on his own would not have been able to gather together this solid group of students and to engage them. Nimsa shuhu nehna me'amalachem. So certainly the Rosh Yeshiva has benefited from the efforts of these administrators, and now he's causing them ruination by opening up his own yeshiva. Umenale hayeshiva mehem shenizoku beparnasasam v'al kol panim yishur tkum b'chovos be'ein efsharut leparo. So these administrators, many have been quite injured financially. They are now in a tremendous debt without a way of paying back those debts. Ki al yedei skirat hayeshiva einam yicholim levakesh temichat hanadvanim machzikei haTorah, because now that they're going to be forced to close the yeshiva, how are they going to pay off their debts? They can't ask for donations for a closed yeshiva, right? Vehein emes shahatalmidim rishayim lilmod eitzel rav shalibam chafetz. Now, on the other hand, of course, a student who wants to study Torah has every right to go to whichever Rosh Yeshiva and whichever Rebbe, he finds that he's drawn to. V'gam Rosh Yeshiva Rashai laharbitz Torah l'mishi yavo elav lilmod. And a Rosh Yeshiva has every right to teach Torah to anyone who comes to him to study. I'm not denying that, he says. Ulam imal yedei harbatzat Torah hu gorem gezel amal acherim hareza mitzvah babi avera. But if in the course of doing this beautiful mitzvah of teaching Torah, you are causing financial ruination to somebody else, and you're stealing from them their hard-earned funds, so then it's a mitzvah haba ba'avera. What is a mitzvah haba ba'avera? That in the course of doing a mitzvah, you're doing an avera. We never justify, the Robin Hood syndrome, where you can justify stealing because you're going to give tzedakah. You can never justify stealing and causing financial ruin to someone just because the final result is kids are going to get to study Torah. And that's where we get into our halacha, that just like a new tutor can't come on the scene and poach away a student if it's going to cause financial loss to the first tutor by getting him fired, the second tutor can't say, well, I want to teach Torah, I want to do a mitzvah, so how can you stop me? Because you can't steal, and you're poaching, right? So even though the students only want to study with that Rosh Yeshiva, that charismatic and that pedagogically talented Rosh Yeshiva, nevertheless, mikol makom asul Rosh Yeshiva lelamed imahim hechi shal yedei who goes eles acher. But he wouldn't be allowed to teach them if, in the course of teaching them, he's causing this yeshiva to close and causing financial ruin to the administrators. Ki lo hutar iser gezel mishum harbatzis Torah la'acherim va'ani Hashem sonei gezel ba'olaksiv. He says just because you're going to be teaching Torah doesn't give you a right to steal. As a matter of fact, when it says in Scripture, I am the Lord who despises theft, it's referring to a person who wishes to bring a sacrifice to God from stolen property. You can't do that. And he continues, he says, Va'ayin b'tshuvas chasam sofer, shakasav de gabi gezela, lo shayach lomar da'aseh delulav adukarban yitche lelo sa'aseh de gezel. So the Chassam Sofer talks about an interesting discussion in the Talmud. We many of us learned Maseches Sukkah together, and we know that one of the discussions in Maseches Sukkah is, can you be yotze the mitzvah of lulav and esrog with a stolen lulav? And so the Chassam Sofer asks a very basic question: why don't you say the principle of aseh dochelos aseh, that you have a positive commandment? And sometimes we know that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. So why don't you say over here too, that the positive commandment of waiving the 4 species on sukkahs overrides the negative commandment of theft? And while there are many different ways to approach this question, the Chassam Sofer says that it just doesn't work that way. Va'afilu yiyeh mitzvah derabim v'lo boi ba'idna d'lo shayach aseh dochelos aseh el b'ma shebein adam l'makom. Aval la'olam lo yitcha aseh lo saseh degez l'kai mitzvah saseh b'mamun chavera v'zeh lo ola al hadas me'olam ad kan devar. It's a mouthful. I'll simplify what he says. He says there are times when you do say that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. There are times when we say that you can suspend perhaps certain laws of ritual impurity, and you can suspend other considerations, but that's only when the positive and the negative are of the same genre of mitzvah, when they're both bein adam lamakom. But if you have to suspend a bein adam lachavero mitzvah, a mitzvah between man and his fellow man, in order to fulfill a mitzvah that's bein adam lamakom, between man and God, that we never do. We never say that it's okay. A guy can't say, I need to daven. I need to have a relationship with God. So I'm going to scream in the middle of shul on the top of my lungs, because that's the only way that I can get proper kavanah, right? So what about everybody else who can't daven in your presence? But my mitzvah aseh, my mitzvah that I need to daven and really connect with God, overrides all other considerations, even if it's going to prevent other people from being able to think clearly. We never say that. We never say that a mitzvah that is vertical between you and God will override a horizontal mitzvah between man and man. So it's like, you can't say, well, I can justify stealing a lulav because I can fulfill a mitzvah between myself and God, because stealing is ben adam lachavero, right? Va'ayin b'drashas chsam soifer uchmo kein pashat the mitzvahs limatorah lahatalmidim eno doche iser gezel. And similarly, it's quite apparent that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, which is a vertical mitzvah ben adam lamakom, between man and God, can never override the purely human interrelational mitzvah of stealing. So that's number one, he says. Ubar mindain. And then in the next paragraph he says, but I'll go one step further, he says, I'll say, besides that, halolo huter lahoshiv sofer b'tzad sofer el mishum yagdol Torah. This is a very important argument that we may even need to go continue on Monday. He says, and we're going to see a lot of this discussion, what about the consideration that even if we could justify competition and open up the market to anyone who wants to compete when it comes to providing religious or spiritual services, but what if the net result of creating a completely open market is that you're going to cause the market to collapse, and then you're going to end up with a net lower amount of religious services? What do we mean by that? He said, I think someone, whether it was Ron or somebody else, was alluding to this yesterday. The Gemara says that any sofer can open up a shingle and provide services in any community. And the only issue that we had was, is he allowed to come from out of town, or is it only permitted if he's a dweller of that town? But let's assume that anyone can set up a shingle in town and say, I'm a sofer, I provide tefillin, I provide mezuzahs, anyone can come to me, even if it's going to potentially cause financial loss to the first guy who set up shop. He says, we've quoted this before. He says, now think about it for a second. If the second guy putting up a shingle that he's now opening up a new yeshiva, or he's opening up a new tutoring service, and that's going to cause the ruination of the first guy, and it's going to cause him a loss of money because he invested so much in his business, and now all of a sudden a new guy comes along and pulls the rug out from under him. Hareza gorim lehiras haTorah. Think about it for a second. He says this is going to cause a tremendous destruction of Torah study. Kimi peti yirtze lahashkia mamono va'ono b'davar sha'alul lefeta l'redet l'timyon ve'in matzil miyado shko. He says, because what fool is going to want to try and open up a business where there's no regulation whatsoever on the market? No one is going to want to open up a business where anyone can come along and completely usurp all of his efforts and cause him to close up shop. In other words, if you're going to go into a good business, your business model should include that it's a service that cannot be replicated so quickly and easily that I'll be put out of business by all of my competitors very easily. And if we're going to create such an open market for people to open up a shingle on religious services, the net result is that people are not going to want to go into the business of providing religious services. Does everyone hear the argument? Is that clear? No one's going to want to go into that business if it's like, who wants to go into the rabbinate today? Who wants to become a teacher today? Who wants to open up a yeshiva today? If there's so many people, if this year you'll open up a yeshiva, the following year, after you've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in a building and hiring teachers, someone else is going to come down the road and open up their yeshiva. If someone were to tell you in their crystal ball that that's what's going to happen to you, or it could potentially very easily happen, why in the world would I want to open up a yeshiva in the first place? Right? The risk is too great. It's not justifiable. So, and he says, "Ubishailos utshuvas chasam sofer kasav deroi lahanik shalom min adin laazor letagore sfarim shelo lahasig gvulam laman lo yishluchim it's benizokin." There's a response from the Chasam Sofer in the 19th century, who says that even though, when it comes to the providing of religious services and Torah study, you can't cap the market in any way. He says, but if there's a Sfarim store, right, a Jewish Sfarim store, and technically another person can come along and open up his own Sfarim store, but the community should cap it and should restrict other Sfarim sellers to come into the community, even though the halacha says you cannot cap it. So the Chassam Sofer says sometimes you have to contravene that halacha for practical reasons. He says, because v'im lo nigzor bifnei po'alei oven lo yikrav od ish el hamalacha v'yisbatlu mochei sfarim Yisrael ein sham. He says, because if we don't put a cap on who can come in and sell svarim, no one's going to want to open up a svarim store. And we've actually seen this happen in the GTA. There was a guy who opened up a place called Sfarim Warehouse, and then all of a sudden a competitor opened up, and eventually they both ended up closing, right? And so, what's the net result to the consumer? Fewer Sfarim are available. Why? Because we opened up the free market on the sale of Sfarim. So even though it's a religious service, and you can say, well, how can you cap religious services? Well, the answer is that if it's going to end up resulting in fewer places where you can get those religious services, because no one's going to want to try to open something up, then yes, you can justify it. V'chein kasav sham shetagari svarim afal pi shekol kavanasam lahanas atzmam roi ligdor shelo yinazku ayin sham. The Chassam Sofer further says, and that even though these svarim sellers are not necessarily the most pious individuals whose whole intention is to educate the public, they really just want to make a living, but nonetheless they have to be protected because it's for the greater public good. V'sham kasav sheyesh ligzor shelo lahasig gevul b'hatfas sfarim dim lo kein tofik Torah ki mipeti yichnos atzmo b'safek hefsek. And now let's go into publication. Now technically, if there's a Torah subject, there really shouldn't be any kind of restriction on trademark, on copyright, and things like that. You should say, well, I need to teach Torah. If I want to teach Torah, then and I can increase Torah study, then let me just take this fellow's typeset and copy it, and I'll sell more Sfarim, there'll be more Torah study. But the Chassam Sofer says you're not allowed to do that, because if every publisher knows that anyone can rip off their intellectual property and just sell it on their own, who's going to want to develop that kind of intellectual property? We have this issue in the entertainment business today, right? In both the music and the motion picture industry. I mean, I grew up with this. My father used to we used to have conversations about this all the time, and we're gonna get more into this halacha about encroaching on intellectual property as we go further into these halachas of hasagas gavul, of encroachment. But the music business faced a tremendous crisis, a couple of decades ago, with, remember, Napster and all of these other peer-to-peer services, where people were downloading music for free without paying for it. It was causing the ruination of the music industry, and it was causing a general degradation of the quality of musicians who were willing to go into the recording business. Because if I know that anyone can come along and take my music for free, what's the point of investing so much in creating music? It's going to end up, even though you might want to say, well, let's share the music and let's make the world a happier place. right? But if it's going to end up causing the diminished production of music, then there's no point. Even with Torah study, if you're going to cause a reduction in Torah study because no one's going to want to open up a business or go into publication or try to invest anything into spreading Torah study or spreading the performance of a mitzvah, then no one's going to want to open up a place because they know that the next guy down the road could capitalize on their investment by opening up a competing place right next door, and no one's going to want to do it. Ve'im kaimalon, moshiven sofer b'tzad sofer, ve'afagav de posak chiyusa dahai v'ho akol mishum yagdil Torah v'yadir, lo l'tovas sofer ela lahagdil Torah. He says, and if we paskin that, if we're going to paskin that any sofer can set up shop, can open up a shingle next to another sofer, even when he's going to be causing the ruination of the first sofer, mikol shekain shenagdir shelo lifsok chiyusa dahai kedei lahagdil Torah ayin sham. He says, and the argument of the Chassam Sofer was, if we can restrict the opening up of a new sofer, so that ultimately there'll be more sofrim in town, and because by capping the market, you're going to encourage people to invest in the sofer business, certainly we can't allow people to willy-nilly publish copyrighted work, and that was the argument of the Chassam Sofer. Umeata. So based on that,
Rabbi, it's called barriers to entry.
Barrier to entry, right? Is that what it's called? That's actually a term, huh?
Barriers to entry, yeah.
Right.
Government regulations or having to set up a factory. Anything that'll block somebody else from coming into the business to reduce competition, to reduce the market.
Right. So he's basically saying by opening the market entirely, you're actually creating more barriers to entry, because no one's going to want to go into this particular industry. Umeata. So based on all of that we've seen up until now, vadai the imnema dirishayim ligram lahorid mamun chavero l'timyon al yidei harbatzas Torah. If we're going to say that it's totally acceptable to cause that first group of administrators to go into financial ruin, and we can justify it because it's going to end up with more Torah study, that's going to actually result in the destruction of Torah study, because now no one's going to want to go into the yeshiva business out of the fear that all it's going to take is some charismatic guy to come along, swoop in, exploit all of our efforts, and take all the students away. Vahadi hitira lahoshiv malamid b'tzad malamid. Hainu rak hechi deleke ella piska l'chiyusei de chavero dainu manias revach ba'asid. He says the only time that we allow a competing school or teacher to put up a shingle for the public in the same community is only when the potential is to cause loss of future income. That we can say, listen, if the competition is good because it'll cause the best Torah teachers to emerge if we allow for open competition, but that's only to prevent, let's say, an inferior teacher from future income. But if the second guy puts up his shingle, and not only does he prevent future profit from the first teacher, but he actually causes him financial loss because he's capitalizing on all of the investment that he put in initially, that we don't find that the rabbis permitted. And not only that, but they're actually causing a net loss of Torah study, because if we create such an open market, it creates a disincentive for people to try to do the same and open up yeshivas in the future. If he knows that any time, a day after he puts in all this investment, someone else can come along. Umeyata vaday she'im hekimu yeshiva b'hashkas mamon v'nichnesu ba'ol choyvis vaday she'im rishayim ligrom l'skiras ha'yeshiva v'al yidei zeh ligrom hezek b'yadayim. And then certainly in our case, therefore, it is not permissible what this Rosh Yeshiva did by opening up his competing yeshiva and poaching all the students. Hein mitzad ikar hadin v'chemosha hochachna mehadatoisus kiddushin ve'hen mitzad hasvara al pi divrei hachsam sofer hanal. Not only based upon the Gemara, that you're not allowed to poach a student away from an existing tutor, but also based on logic that we've provided from the Chasam Sofer, that this is not increasing Torah study, but it is actually decreasing Torah study. I'll just look quickly. We'll okay, it's a little bit of additional material, but it's not super important for us to go through it right now. The conclusion of Rav Gestetner is that he does not permit this Rosh Yeshiva to open up yeshiva. Either that, or he'll have to compensate damages to the original administrators who started the yeshiva in the first place. So this is a very important tshuva, sort of to help confirm what we've been studying all along in our discussion of not being able to poach a student away from another tutor. Okay, so we're going to find that many of these arguments are going to be relevant in a lot of halachic decision making when it comes to allowing competitors to open up, not just for religious services, but for any services, whether it's clothes, whether it's medical services, whether it's any other services that you may be thinking about. Okay, so I think we'll hold it here for today. We're already over time. Let me wish you all a good Shabbos, and I hope everyone